In the winter of 1406, a 27-year-old king lay dying in his chamber at the Alcazar of Toledo. Henry III of Castile, known as the Sufferer, had ruled for 16 tumultuous years, yet history would remember him for what the chroniclers dared not write. Medieval records speak of a monarch who defied every expectation of medieval kingship, a man whose personal life became the source of whispered scandals that threatened to topple a dynasty. According to contemporary accounts, his final words were not of his kingdom or his heir, but a plea for understanding that would never come. The chronicles tell us that Henry III was different from birth. Born in 1379, during one of the most violent periods in Castilian history, he inherited more than just a crown. He inherited a legacy of blood, betrayal, and the crushing weight of royal expectations that would ultimately destroy him. Historical records indicate that even as a child, his behavior concerned the court. Documents suggest he showed little interest in the traditional pursuits of medieval princes, hunting, warfare, and the company of women. What made Henry's story particularly tragic was not just his frail health, but the growing suspicions about his personal relationships that would haunt his entire reign. Medieval chroniclers, writing in the coded language of their time, documented court rumors that spoke of the young king's unusual affections and his preference for the company of male courtiers over potential brides. If you're fascinated by these hidden stories of medieval royalty, make sure to subscribe for more forgotten histories that challenge everything we thought we knew about the past. The Castilian nobility watched with growing alarm as their king consistently rejected marriage proposals from across Europe. Contemporary sources record that Henry's refusal to secure the royal bloodline became a matter of urgent political concern. Some scholars believe that his resistance wasn't merely political calculation, but something far more personal. A young man trapped between his authentic self and the suffocating demands of medieval kingship. Documents from the royal archives reveal that by his early 20s, Henry had surrounded himself with a circle of young nobles whose loyalty to him transcended typical courtly relationships. Historians suggest these bonds may have gone beyond the conventional master-servant dynamic expected in medieval courts. The chronicler Lopez de Ayala, writing carefully within the constraints of his time, noted that the king showed excessive fondness for certain courtiers. Language that medieval readers would have understood carried deeper implications. The most telling evidence comes from papal correspondence and letters from foreign courts, where Henry's reluctance to marry became a diplomatic embarrassment. Records indicate that by 1400, European royalty had begun questioning whether the Castilian throne would have a legitimate heir. Some historians argue that this wasn't merely concern about dynasty. It was the beginning of a moral panic that would consume Henry's final years. But the young king's greatest battles weren't fought on medieval battlefields. They were waged in the shadows of his own court, where every gesture was scrutinized and every friendship became potential evidence of his unfitness to rule. What happened next would reveal just how dangerous it was to be different in medieval Spain, and how far a kingdom would go to silence truths that threatened their understanding of royal legitimacy. The year 1379 was soaked in blood across the Iberian Peninsula. When Henry III drew his first breath in the palace of Burgos, the screams of civil war still echoed through the stone corridors. His father, John III of Castile, had seized the throne just 5 years earlier through a brutal campaign that left thousands dead and the nobility fractured beyond repair. According to court records, the infant prince was so frail that physicians doubted he would survive his first winter. His pale complexion and labored breathing would become defining characteristics that medieval chroniclers interpreted as omens of the troubled reign to come. Historical documents reveal that Henry's birth was both a blessing and a curse for the Trastamara dynasty. Contemporary sources indicate that while his arrival secured the royal succession, his obvious physical weakness sparked immediate concerns about his fitness to rule. Palace physicians, writing in medical treatises of the time, described a child prone to mysterious fevers and fainting spells that would plague him throughout his life. Some historians suggest these health issues may have shaped his personality, making him more introspective and sensitive than the typical medieval prince. The political landscape of Henry's childhood was a minefield of competing loyalties and unhealed wounds. His grandfather, Henry II, the Bastard, had murdered his predecessor in hand-to-hand combat, establishing the Trastamara line through violence that many nobles never forgot. Records show that several powerful families continued to question the dynasty's legitimacy, viewing young Henry as the product of a cursed bloodline. Chronicles from the period describe how courtiers would cross themselves when the sickly prince passed, whispering that God had marked him for suffering. According to contemporary accounts, Henry's education differed markedly from that of other medieval princes. While his tutors attempted to teach him swordplay and horsemanship, his frail constitution made such pursuits nearly impossible. Instead, palace records indicate he excelled in languages, theology, and the arts, subjects that some nobles viewed with suspicion as too scholarly for a future warrior king. Documents suggest that by age 8, he could read Latin fluently and showed an unusual interest in poetry and music, preferences that would later fuel rumors about his masculinity. The most telling insight into Henry's early personality comes from letters written by his tutor, the scholar and chronicler Pero López de Ayala. In carefully worded correspondence with church officials, López de Ayala noted that the young prince showed uncommon gentleness and an excessive attachment to male servants and pages. While such language was diplomatic, historians interpret these descriptions as early indicators that Henry's emotional development was following patterns that concerned the medieval court. The death of Henry's father in 1390 transformed the 11-year-old boy from a sheltered prince into the most powerful person in Castile, at least on paper. Contemporary sources record that the coronation ceremony had to be shortened due to the young king's visible exhaustion and trembling. Witnesses described a child overwhelmed by the weight of the crown, literally and figuratively, as he struggled to remain upright during the 3-hour service. But the crown that now rested on Henry's head came with expectations that would prove impossible to fulfill. The Castilian nobility demanded a king who could lead armies, produce heirs, and embody the masculine ideals of medieval kingship. What they got instead was a frail, scholarly boy whose true nature would soon put him on a collision course with everything his kingdom believed about power, masculinity, and royal duty. At 11 years old, Henry III inherited a kingdom that had no intention of letting him rule it. The Regency Council that formed after his father's death was a collection of ambitious nobles who viewed the sickly young king not as their sovereign, but as a convenient puppet through whom they could exercise power. Contemporary records reveal that the boy king was essentially imprisoned within his own palace, with every decision filtered through a council that treated him more like a valuable hostage than a monarch. The regency was dominated by 3 powerful figures: his uncle Fernando de Antequera, Archbishop Pedro Tenorio of Toledo, and the influential nobleman Ruy López Dávalos. Documents from the royal archives show that these men made no effort to prepare Henry for actual rule. Instead, historians suggest they deliberately kept him weak and dependent, ensuring that their own authority remained unchallenged. Court records indicate that Henry was rarely consulted on matters of state, spending most of his time in isolated study or recovering from his frequent illnesses. According to chroniclers of the period, the young king's physical frailty made him an easy target for manipulation. Palace accounts describe a boy who often collapsed during formal ceremonies and required assistance to simply stand during court functions. Some scholars argue that his regents may have even encouraged his poor health, perhaps by controlling his diet or limiting his physical activity, to maintain their grip on power. The medieval mindset equated physical weakness with unfitness to rule, and Henry's condition provided perfect justification for continued regency. What made the situation particularly cruel was how the regents used Henry's emerging personality against him. As he reached adolescence, court observers began noting his preference for scholarly pursuits over martial training. Letters between noble houses describe the young king's growing interest in literature, music, and theological discussions. interests that his regents publicly dismissed as unsuitable for a warrior king. Historians interpret this as a deliberate campaign to undermine Henry's confidence and justify their continued control. The most damaging aspect of the regency was how it isolated Henry from potential allies and meaningful relationships. Contemporary sources suggest that the boy king was forbidden from forming close friendships with young nobles his own age, ostensibly for security reasons. Palace regulations from this period show that male pages and servants who grew too familiar with the king were quickly reassigned or dismissed. Some historians believe this isolation was intentional, designed to prevent Henry from developing the personal loyalties that might have helped him eventually break free from regency control. By 1395, as Henry approached his 16th birthday and the end of his official minority, tensions within the court began to escalate. Documents reveal that several minor nobles started questioning whether the regents intended to ever relinquish power. More troubling still, court gossip recorded by various chroniclers suggests that Henry's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic and emotional, traits that his regents eagerly highlighted as evidence of his continued unfitness to rule. But the young king was beginning to fight back in ways that would shock the medieval court. As Henry started asserting his royal authority, his choices of close companions and advisors would reveal desires that threatened everything the nobility believed about kingship. The regents who had controlled him for so long were about to discover that their isolated, sickly puppet had developed a will of his own and preferences that would scandalize the entire kingdom. The medieval chroniclers who recorded Henry III's reign walked a dangerous tightrope between truth and survival. In an age where speaking too openly about royal misconduct could result in exile or death, court historians developed a sophisticated code language that allowed them to document scandalous behavior while maintaining plausible deniability. Contemporary records from this period reveal a pattern of carefully chosen words and biblical references that medieval readers would have immediately understood as accusations of sexual deviance. The most prominent chronicler of Henry's reign, Pero López de Ayala, provides the clearest glimpse into the court's growing unease with their young king's behavior. In his Crónica del Rey Don Enrique III, López de Ayala writes with unusual restraint about certain aspects of royal life, using phrases that historians now recognize as coded warnings. When he describes the king's excessive fondness for beautiful young men and his reluctance to embrace the company of noble ladies, medieval readers would have understood the implications immediately. According to multiple chronicle sources, Henry's court became notorious throughout Europe for its unusual atmosphere. Foreign ambassadors' reports, preserved in various royal archives, describe a Castilian court where young male favorites enjoyed unprecedented access to the king's private chambers. Documents suggest that several of these relationships caused particular concern, especially Henry's attachment to a young nobleman named Álvaro de Luna, whose rapid rise to prominence sparked whispers throughout the kingdom. Tell me in the comments what part of this story shocks you the most so far. And if you're enjoying this documentary, make sure to subscribe for more stories that reveal the hidden truth of medieval. The most damning evidence comes from church records, where bishops and abbots documented their growing alarm about the spiritual state of their kingdom. Letters between religious authorities describe Henry's court as a place where unnatural affections flourished under royal protection. One particularly telling document from the Bishop of Toledo warns that the king's behavior was becoming a source of moral corruption that threatens the very foundations of Christian kingship. Such language was extraordinary for the time, representing an unprecedented break in the traditional loyalty between crown and church. Chronicles from neighboring kingdoms provide additional insight into how Henry's reputation spread beyond Castile's borders. Portuguese court records describe diplomatic meetings where Henry's envoys were questioned about their king's marital prospects, with foreign nobles expressing open skepticism about his ability to produce heirs. Some historians argue that these international concerns may have been deliberately cultivated by Henry's enemies within his own court, who sought to undermine his legitimacy through strategic gossip. The chroniclers also documented the growing tension between Henry and the powerful noble families who had expected him to conform to traditional royal behavior. court records show that by 1399, several influential houses had begun questioning whether a king who showed such unmanly preferences could effectively defend the realm. Medieval concepts of kingship were intimately tied to masculine virility, and Henry's apparent indifference to women struck at the heart of royal authority. But perhaps most revealing of all are the silences in these chronicles, the careful omissions and diplomatic gaps that speak louder than any written accusations. When chroniclers stopped recording certain aspects of court life or used unusually vague language to describe royal activities, they were creating a historical record that preserved dangerous truths for those who knew how to read between the lines. What they recorded next would shatter any remaining illusions about Henry's fitness to rule in medieval Spain. By the time Henry III reached his 20th year, marriage proposals flooded the Castilian court from every corner of Europe. Medieval kingship demanded dynastic alliance, and the nobility expected their monarch to secure the royal bloodline through strategic matrimony. Yet contemporary records reveal that Henry met each proposal with the same response: delay, deflection, and ultimately rejection. His systematic refusal to embrace his marital duties would become one of the most politically dangerous aspects of his reign. According to diplomatic correspondence preserved in various European archives, Henry was considered an exceptionally valuable marriage prospect despite his physical frailty. His kingdom was wealthy, his bloodline legitimate, and his youth made him attractive to fathers seeking advantageous matches for their daughters. Letters from French, English, Portuguese, and Aragonese courts document at least 12 serious marriage negotiations initiated between 1399 and 1404. Historians suggest that each proposal was met with elaborate excuses about Henry's poor health, his dedication to spiritual matters, or the need to focus on pressing political concerns. The most persistent suitor was King Charles VI of France, who repeatedly offered his daughter Isabella as a bride for the Castilian king. French diplomatic records show that negotiations dragged on for nearly 3 years, with Henry's representatives constantly requesting delays while their king recovered from various illnesses or dealt with urgent state business. Contemporary sources indicate that the French court eventually grew suspicious of these endless postponements, with one ambassador writing that Henry seemed to flee from marriage as other men flee from plague. Palace records reveal that Henry's own nobles began pressuring him privately about his matrimonial obligations. Documents suggest that by 1402, influential courtiers were holding secret meetings to discuss their king's alarming reluctance to produce an heir. Some historians argue that this pressure may have stemmed not just from dynastic concerns, but from growing awareness that Henry's personal inclinations made traditional marriage unlikely. Medieval society viewed royal celibacy with deep suspicion, interpreting it as either spiritual arrogance or unnatural desire. The situation became particularly tense when Henry's cousin, Fernando de Antequera, began positioning himself as a potential heir to the Castilian throne. Court chronicles describe how Fernando's supporters started quietly suggesting that perhaps God had chosen a different branch of the royal family to continue the dynasty. According to contemporary accounts, this maneuvering created a dangerous political dynamic where Henry's marital status became directly linked to his legitimacy as king. What made Henry's position even more precarious was his apparent comfort with his unmarried state. Unlike other medieval kings, who at least pretended enthusiasm for matrimonial negotiations, Henry seemed genuinely indifferent to the prospect of taking a wife. Documents from the papal archives suggest that church officials began questioning whether the king might be considering a religious vocation, though his lifestyle hardly suggested monastic aspirations. The breaking point came in 1404, when Henry's own council formally demanded that he choose a bride within 6 months or face potential deposition. Chronicles record that the king's response to this ultimatum shocked the medieval court. Instead of promising compliance, he began making decisions that would reveal exactly why marriage held no appeal for him. His choices of intimate companions were about to become impossible to ignore, setting the stage for a confrontation that would define his reign. When Henry III began asserting his independence as king, his choice of companions sent shockwaves through the medieval court that would never fully recover. Contemporary chronicles document how the young monarch surrounded himself with a circle of handsome young nobles whose proximity to royal power defied every convention of medieval hierarchy. According to court records, these relationships transcended the typical bonds between sovereign and subject, creating an atmosphere that scandalized even the most worldly courtiers. The most documented of these relationships was Henry's attachment to Álvaro de Luna, a minor nobleman whose rapid ascension to royal favorite became the subject of intense court gossip. Palace financial records show that within months of their first meeting, Luna was receiving extraordinary gifts from the royal treasury: luxurious clothing, expensive horses, and a private apartment within the king's own quarters. Historians suggest that such lavish attention toward a relatively unknown courtier was unprecedented in Castilian court protocol and immediately aroused suspicion among established nobles. According to multiple chronicle sources, Henry's behavior toward his male favorites differed markedly from his interactions with female courtiers or potential brides. Contemporary observers noted that the king displayed an animated, almost intimate manner when conversing with certain young men, while remaining distant and formal with women of marriageable age. Documents suggest that this contrast became so pronounced that foreign ambassadors began commenting on the unusual dynamics within the Castilian court. The most telling evidence comes from detailed accounts of court ceremonies and daily routines preserved in administrative records. These documents reveal that Henry insisted on having his male favorites present at private meetings, traditionally reserved for senior advisors or family members. Some historians argue that this inclusion of young, relatively inexperienced men in sensitive political discussions represented a deliberate challenge to established court hierarchy, suggesting that Henry valued these relationships above conventional political wisdom. Palace staff records provide additional insight into the intimate nature of these companionships. Contemporary accounts describe how certain young nobles enjoyed unlimited access to the king's private chambers, dining with him informally and participating in activities typically reserved for family members. According to chroniclers of the period, several of these men maintained rooms adjacent to Henry's own quarters, an arrangement that violated traditional protocols governing royal privacy and security. The church's response to these relationships was particularly revealing. Letters between bishops and abbots document growing concern about the corrupting influence of certain courtiers on their king's spiritual development. One particularly damning document from the Archbishop of Toledo suggests that Henry's confessors were struggling to address what they diplomatically termed occasions of sin within the royal household. Such ecclesiastical intervention was extraordinary, representing a direct challenge to royal authority over court appointments and personal relationships. What made these companionships especially dangerous for Henry was their visibility. Unlike previous monarchs who might have conducted questionable relationships with discretion, Henry seemed almost defiant in his openness. Court records indicate that he frequently appeared in public, accompanied by his favorites, displayed obvious affection toward them during formal ceremonies, and showed little concern for the whispered conversations their presence inevitably generated. But the Castilian nobility was reaching the limit of their tolerance. As Henry's relationships became increasingly impossible to ignore, powerful families began coordinating their response to what they viewed as an assault on the moral foundations of their kingdom. The tipping point came in 1405, when a coalition of Castilian nobles began meeting secretly to address what they considered the greatest crisis to face their kingdom since the civil wars of the previous century. Contemporary documents reveal that these clandestine gatherings were not merely about policy disagreements or territorial disputes. They were fundamentally about whether a king whose personal conduct violated every medieval ideal of masculine authority could legitimately continue to rule. Leading this growing opposition was Fernando de Antequera, Henry's ambitious cousin who had never abandoned his own royal aspirations. According to letters preserved in various noble archives, Fernando skillfully transformed Henry's personal relationships into a political weapon, arguing that a king who showed such unnatural preferences posed a direct threat to the moral order that held Christian society together. Court records suggest that Fernando's rhetoric was carefully calculated, using religious language to justify what was essentially a power grab disguised as moral reform. The most damaging aspect of the nobility's campaign against Henry was how they weaponized his health and behavior to question his divine right to rule. Medieval political theory held that kings ruled by God's grace, but chronicles from this period document how Henry's opponents argued that his physical weakness and moral corruption were signs of divine displeasure. Historians suggest that this theological attack was particularly effective because it provided religious justification for what might otherwise be seen as simple rebellion against legitimate authority. Palace records reveal that Henry found himself increasingly isolated as former allies distanced themselves from his court. Documents show that several noble families who had previously supported the Trastamara dynasty began withdrawing their sons from royal service, ostensibly for family reasons, but more likely to avoid association with the mounting scandal. According to contemporary accounts, even servants and minor officials began requesting transfers to other royal households, creating a brain drain that severely weakened Henry's ability to govern effectively. The economic pressure was equally devastating. Financial records indicate that several powerful noble houses began delaying tax payments and questioning royal expenditures, particularly those benefiting Henry's favorites. Some historians argue that this financial resistance represented a coordinated attempt to force the king to choose between his personal relationships and his kingdom's stability. Chronicles describe how Henry's opponents spread stories about the unseemly gifts lavished on certain courtiers, using royal generosity toward male favorites as evidence of poor judgment and moral corruption. Church officials, initially reluctant to directly challenge royal authority, began adding their voices to the growing chorus of criticism. Letters between bishops document their increasing willingness to publicly question whether a king who lived in such apparent violation of Christian morality could effectively defend the faith against external enemies. According to papal correspondence from this period, even Rome was receiving reports about the scandalous nature of Henry's court, creating international pressure for reform. What made the situation particularly precarious for Henry was his apparent refusal to acknowledge the growing danger. Court observers noted that rather than attempting to appease his critics, the king seemed to double down on his controversial behavior, promoting his favorites to even higher positions and displaying even greater public affection toward them. By 1405, the pressure on Henry III to conform to medieval expectations of kingship had reached a breaking point. Court records reveal a systematic campaign to control every aspect of his personal life, as nobles and church officials implemented increasingly desperate measures to force their king into traditional masculine behavior. Contemporary documents describe a young man caught between his authentic self and the suffocating demands of a kingdom that viewed his very nature as a threat to royal authority. The most documented effort to reform Henry's behavior came through forced separation from his closest companions. Palace administrative records show that several of the king's favorite courtiers were suddenly reassigned to distant provinces, ostensibly for important diplomatic missions, but more likely to break their influence over the monarch. According to chroniclers of the period, Henry's reaction to these separations was devastating. Witnesses described a king who became withdrawn, melancholic, and increasingly resistant to court obligations. Church officials played a particularly aggressive role in attempting to redirect Henry's personal inclinations. Letters between bishops and the papal court document coordinated efforts to surround the king with morally reliable advisors and confessors, specifically chosen to address what they termed his spiritual struggles. Historians suggest that these religious interventions went far beyond typical royal counseling, representing a systematic attempt to reshape Henry's fundamental identity through intense spiritual pressure and guilt. The nobility also implemented strict protocols governing Henry's daily activities and social interactions. Contemporary accounts describe new court regulations that required constant supervision during the king's private meetings and eliminated opportunities for unsupervised contact with young male courtiers. Documents reveal that even Henry's personal servants were replaced with older married men deemed less likely to develop inappropriate relationships with their monarch. Perhaps most cruelly, Henry's opponents began a whisper campaign designed to convince him that his personal happiness was incompatible with his royal duties. According to court chronicles, influential nobles repeatedly emphasized that the king's unnatural desires were not merely personal failings, but betrayals of his divine obligation to produce heirs and defend Christian morality. Some historians argue that this psychological warfare was deliberately calculated to break Henry's spirit and force him into a traditional marriage. The economic weapons were equally harsh. Financial records indicate that royal expenditures on gifts for male favorites were eliminated entirely, while Henry's personal allowance was reduced and placed under council oversight. Contemporary sources suggest that this financial control was designed to demonstrate the king's dependence on noble cooperation, making clear that his personal autonomy existed only at their sufferance. Most tragically, documents reveal that Henry began to internalize his critics' condemnation. Palace observers noted that the once defiant king started displaying signs of deep shame and self-doubt, occasionally making public statements about his unworthiness and the burden of his royal responsibilities. According to court chroniclers, Henry seemed to be slowly accepting the medieval world's verdict that his authentic self was fundamentally incompatible with legitimate kingship. But this campaign to break Henry's spirit would ultimately backfire in the most spectacular way possible. The king, who had been forced to suppress his true nature, was about to explode in a final act of defiance that would scandalize medieval Europe. What happened to Henry III was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader medieval phenomenon where accusations of sexual deviance became the ultimate weapon against inconvenient rulers. Contemporary records from across Europe reveal a disturbing pattern where kings who threatened established power structures found their personal lives weaponized by ambitious nobles and threatened church officials. According to historians specializing in medieval political theory, Henry's persecution represented a textbook example of how sexual morality was used to justify political rebellion disguised as moral reform. The Castilian case became particularly significant because it demonstrated how quickly medieval society could turn against even legitimate monarchs when their personal conduct challenged fundamental assumptions about masculine authority. Documents from neighboring kingdoms show that Henry's story spread rapidly throughout European courts, serving as both cautionary tale and instruction manual for nobles seeking to undermine royal authority. Some historians argue that the systematic nature of the campaign against Henry established precedents that would influence royal politics for generations. Church records reveal the crucial role religious authorities played in transforming personal conduct into political crisis. Letters between Spanish bishops and the papal court document how church officials deliberately framed Henry's relationships as threats to Christian civilization itself, using theological arguments to justify what was essentially a coordinated assault on royal autonomy. According to contemporary accounts, sermons in major cathedrals began including veiled references to the corruption spreading from the highest levels of society, creating a climate where opposition to the king became a religious duty. The most insidious aspect of this moral panic was how it redefined the very nature of legitimate kingship. Medieval political theory had traditionally emphasized divine right and royal blood, but Henry's case established a new principle, that personal morality could override dynastic claims. Chronicles from this period document how nobles argued that God would not permit an unnatural king to rule successfully, using Henry's frequent illnesses and political struggles as evidence of divine displeasure. Foreign observers provided particularly revealing insights into how the Castilian crisis was perceived across Europe. Diplomatic correspondence preserved in various royal archives shows that ambassadors from England, France, and Portugal began questioning whether Henry possessed the masculine virtues necessary for effective kingship. According to these sources, European courts started treating Castile as a cautionary example of what happened when royal authority became separated from traditional gender expectations. The systematic erasure of inconvenient truths began even during Henry's lifetime. Palace records indicate that certain court chronicles were recalled and revised, with references to controversial relationships edited out or recontextualized as political alliances. Historians suggest that this historical revisionism was coordinated by Henry's opponents, who understood that controlling the narrative was essential to justifying their actions against a legitimate monarch. Perhaps most tragically, the moral panic surrounding Henry created a template for future persecution of non-conforming rulers. Documents reveal that the techniques developed to undermine Henry, the combination of religious condemnation, economic pressure, and social isolation, became standard tools for ambitious nobles seeking to challenge royal authority throughout medieval Europe. But this kingdom-wide campaign to erase Henry's authentic identity was about to reach its ultimate conclusion. The king who had defied every attempt to reshape him was running out of time, and his enemies were preparing to ensure that his story would be buried, along with his inconvenient truth. On Christmas Day, 1406, Henry III of Castile died at the Alcazar of Toledo at just 27 years old. Contemporary medical accounts describe a king whose body had finally surrendered to chronic illnesses, but palace records suggest his spirit had been broken long before his physical death. According to court chronicles, his final months were marked by increasing isolation and what historians interpret as the psychological toll of suppressing his authentic self under relentless pressure. The speed with which Henry's controversial legacy was sanitized reveals the systematic campaign to erase inconvenient truths. Within days of his death, palace administrators began collecting documents related to the late king's personal relationships and court scandals. According to archival records, several prominent chronicles were recalled from monasteries and noble libraries for correction. Historians suggest this immediate historical revisionism was coordinated by the same nobles who had opposed Henry, ensuring future generations would never understand his true struggles. The official narrative painted Henry as a pious but sickly king whose reign was marked by political challenges and health problems, with no mention of the relationships that had defined his life. Contemporary sources reveal how church officials worked with court historians to reframe Henry's story, transforming a tale of persecution into a conventional account of royal duty and Christian suffering. Documents indicate references to specific courtiers were removed, intimate relationships were recontextualized as political alliances, and Henry's resistance to marriage was explained through spiritual devotion. Perhaps most tragically, the erasure extended to people closest to Henry. Records show several former favorites disappeared from court entirely after his death, with some historians suggesting they may have been quietly eliminated to prevent them from contradicting the official narrative. Those who survived were either bought off with pensions or threatened into silence, creating comprehensive suppression of anyone who might have preserved Henry's true story. Foreign courts quickly adopted the sanitized version of events. Diplomatic correspondence from months following Henry's death shows remarkable consensus among European nobility to treat his reign as a cautionary tale about physical weakness rather than the tragedy of forced conformity. According to historians, this international cooperation demonstrates how thoroughly medieval society rejected any challenge to traditional masculine kingship. The most heartbreaking aspect is how completely this historical erasure succeeded. For over 6 centuries, Henry III remained a footnote in Spanish history, a weak king who died young and left no lasting impact. The vibrant, defiant young man who dared to love authentically in a world demanding conformity was buried beneath layers of diplomatic language and religious justification. But today, as we uncover the hidden stories medieval society tried to suppress, Henry's tragedy speaks across centuries. His life reminds us that the struggle for authenticity, acceptance, and the right to love without shame is not a modern invention. It's a human story repeated throughout history. If you've been moved by Henry's story and want to discover more forgotten histories like this, Make sure to subscribe and join us as we continue uncovering the hidden truths that reveal just how complex, human, and heartbreaking the past really was.